and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I'm Professor of Government at Georgetown University, and I also direct the Iranian Studies Unit here. It's a pleasure having all of you here with us today. Thank you so very much for being here. It is also a pleasure having a good friend of mine be with us here today to talk about a topic of tremendous importance. Dr. Ruzbeh Parsi is a PhD holder from Lund University in Sweden. He earned his PhD in history from the same institution, and he is currently a senior visiting lecturer at the university. He was previously the head of the MENA program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I should mention that Ruzbeh studied in Germany as well and is fluent in German, and on Wednesday, you're all invited to come to a talk at 1 p.m. at Georgetown University, where he will be talking about German guilt gone awry, Germany and the Gaza genocide currently. So today, however, we're here to talk about an entirely different topic altogether, which is, did all that was solid melt into air? The Islamic Republic at an impasse. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruzbeh Parsi.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Professor Kamrava and his esteemed colleagues for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. So my talk, and the title, just to give you, the title is a paraphrase of a very famous line in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto that is often quoted when discussing modernity and how modernity changes and dissolves various kinds of institutional and societal bonds. So in that sense, I think it's very apt, because we are in a sense looking at an Islamic Republic in Iran that has been grappling with modernity in all kinds of ways for 125 years, more or less. So after this long 20th century, if you want to call it that, where is Iran, and more importantly, the Islamic Republic at? So my focus here now today is decision-making, or the lack thereof, within the Islamic Republic. But I need to kind of go back, I'm an historian after all, to go back a bit in history to look at some of the very important elements of the dynamics of how this society and this state has been fighting with and against each other in the past century. So if you want to make it very simple, you can say that this is a story that always seems to revolve around three elements: God, state, and the people. In essence, what is the role of God in statehood, and who are the people who the state believes itself to govern over? And here, of course, nationalism and religion are very important elements, because for a long time in Iran, the question has been who counts as an Iranian. That, if we go back to the 1920s and 30s, were a very important discussion, exactly because the state was forging this nation and deciding who was Iranian and who was not. So there are basically three M's, three meme involved here. There is mashru'e, mashrute, and maslahat. So basically the issue of legitimacy, the issue of constitutionalism as a source of that legitimacy, but also expediency. How can you be pragmatic in reconciling things that seem, at least on paper, to be irreconcilable? And if there is anything the Islamic Republic has mastered or made into its own brand, it is maslahat. And that, of course, gives you some element of survivability. You can be pragmatic when your principles collide with a reality that does not conform to your principles. But at some point, you also have to ask yourself, what is the point of all the pragmatism? What is the sense of direction? What is it supposed to overcome? And therefore, what is the goal that you're trying to achieve? So Iranian history in the last 100 years has, in a sense, been a story of people going from being subjects to citizens. But whenever they are citizens, it comes with a caveat that the state still wants to decide for them what it means to be citizen. So the Pahlavi monarchy decided what it meant to be citizen and how they should literally look. And the Islamic Republic wants to decide for people what it means to be citizen and also what they should look like. So this is, if you will, a story that has not yet been resolved. Now, the Islamic Republic is a rather different kind of beast, if you will, in the zoo of state institutional arrangements, because it is trying to marry religious legitimacy with the very modern popular notion of republican legitimacy. So both the popular vote to decide, but also at the same time the claim that there is a divine legitimacy that underpins the whole thing. And as an experiment, it has survived longer than most people would expect. But in terms of its success, a lot remains to be desired. And in fact, what a lot of people in Iran themselves, including people who are within the clergy and elsewhere, have reached the conclusion that both are actually worse off. And I will get back to that. So both the sense of religion and religious authority, but also people, society, and state have actually come out of this experiment in a worse situation than they were before. Now, so this is the issue of legitimacy. The other issue, of course, is authority. That is, who decides and how do we reach decisions. Now, most systems will try and strive for consensus. Everyone claims that even if we have differences in how we reach the decision, once it's settled, we kind of move on together, we soldier on. And the advantage of this is, of course, to be able to claim unity and cohesion. The disadvantage, which has become very clear in the Iranian case, is it's what we in customer service would call slow response rate. That is that the Iranian state is very slow at taking in and revising its decisions because there are so many groups that have to be satisfied about any change of direction. And so we return to the idea of pragmatism and muddling through. A lot of the time, there simply is no decision. It's just the force of inertia continuing roughly in the direction that we're already going at. Now, this is, of course, not unique to Iran, but perhaps in the Iranian case, what we're seeing is that the country is in a region and in conflicts, some of them quite of their own making, where you cannot afford just simply muddling through or going in the same direction that you've always been going in. Now, Iran has so far had two supreme leaders, and the position of the supreme leader is this strange place, somehow outside and inside the constitutional order. It's supposedly a divine mandate to some degree, and at the same time, he is literally elected by the people through a number of institutional mechanisms that make sure that they don't choose the wrong one, as it were. Now, the first supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, was, of course, someone whose source of legitimacy came from the fact that he was the father of the revolution itself. And so in many ways, the state was designed somewhat haphazardly along the way as he saw fit. So in a sense, he was the one who decided where it was supposed to go, and he doesn't seem to have known where it was supposed to go from the beginning. So there was no grand plan. Like with some other revolutionary movements, you can see that in theory, they have everything planned out, and then they are confronted with reality, and the state and the institutions that they build turn out to be a bit more hopscotch than you would expect. Now, decision-making in a system where everyone supposedly is an Islamist should be simple. And of course, it turned out it wasn't, because the Iranian system and the political elite has a number of factions, and no matter how small or big you make the circle of what is allowed, you end up with having at least two different poles. So in that sense, the Islamic Republic's way of dealing with politics, both vis-a-vis society through elections that are engineered to some degree, but also the political elite itself, is a bit like a magnet. If you split the magnet, it will still have a north and a south pole. No matter how small you make the magnet, there will be a north and a south pole. And that dynamic exists within the Iranian system. And often, it actually hinges not so much on ideology, but on things that are much more mundane, but also therefore much more important for the population at large, like economy. What is the economic policy? Where do you stand? And so no matter how many people are allowed in that conversation, you're going to end up with something that those of us who are not steeped in this kind of theocratic idea would call left and right. What is the role of the state in government? How should it deal with the economy, etc., etc. Now, Khomeini had a much easier job than his successor. Khomeini, being the father of the revolution, could decide, and he also at the same time wanted the factions, at least in the sense that he wanted to make sure that they all survived. He used to famously say that the reformists and the hardliners, as we call them today, were the two wings of a dove. So this bird cannot fly with just one of them. So he, in a sense, played them against each other and made sure that none of them won so much that the direction would become ideologically just simply in one way. But, and here comes the very big but compared to his successor, once he needed to make a decision, he very much made them. Now, it doesn't mean that they were good decisions, but they are important for how the state functions and the direction that it takes. So, I will give you two examples which I consider at least to be among the most consequential ones for the Islamic Republic itself. The first one deals with the most obvious thing. Iran is called the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's a republic, but it is also Islamic in a theocratic sense. That's the whole point of the position of the supreme leader. Now, in 1987, when he was coming into the twilight of his years, as it were, he issued a fatwa among several decisions where he basically implicitly and partly explicitly said the state decides what religion is and is not. As in, the state sets the criteria for what is religiously pragmatic and relevant for the state and therefore for society. So in a sense, having gotten tired of his colleagues in Rome, who by definition, like all kind of theological seminaries, argue about things, he said there can be no more argument. This is not a seminary. This is a pyramid of authority. And once the state decides that this is what Islam is, then that's closed. Now, you could, of course, say this is very pragmatic, and it is, but at the same time, of course, it abrogates the very tradition of Shia learning, which is to argue, and a collegial system where no one has supreme authority, and the various interpretations can live on in the different seminaries, and they can be quoted and used for posterity as people see fit. So in that sense, he went from Qom, where he could thrive as a revolutionary in the 60s and 70s, using that diversity, to coming to the 1980s when he was running a state and deciding he's had enough of the conversations and the discussions and the bickering, if you will, and decided now this is what the state does. And what the state does is what religion is. So he became someone who put supremacy in Tehran rather than in Rome, if you want to put it like that. Now, one of the end results of all of this is twofold development. One, in a sense that it has alienated to some degree the Rouhaniyun, the clergy, if you want to call them that, from the state, and made clear that there is a division between those who believe in this project and those who don't. Now, the latter don't make much noise because they're not really allowed to, but most likely they consist of the majority. And the other one is that Iran today is probably the most secularized it has ever been. Iran today is more secularized than any of the Pahlavi monarchs could ever have dreamt of. Not in the sense that the state does not use religion, it does very much, but in the sense of people believing in religious authority. So it's not that people necessarily are atheists, but they are probably much less inclined to believe in the religious authority of the clergy than they have ever been previously, and much less than they were in the 1960s and 70s when that same clergy could mobilize them for the revolution. This is, of course, not what Khomeini intended, but that nonetheless is the result. The other consequential decision that he took was a year later, in 1988, when he first was forced, as he said, to empty the chalice of poison, which was to acknowledge that Iran could not win the war against Iraq, and therefore had to agree to an armistice and at some point something that looks like a peace with Iraq. And the other one, how to make sure that the Islamic Republic would continue in the direction that he wanted. And there I think the important decision that he took was the mass executions in 1988, through which all the previous revolutionaries who belonged to various leftist groups who had been in prison were put to death after something that very much was a circus and less of a legal process, and through that made clear to all the other political decision makers and captains of the state that you're either with me in this decision and therefore equally responsible, or you do not accept it and then you are no longer part of the inner circle. And probably the most important victim of that decision was Ayatollah Montazeri, who was his designated heir, who through his unwillingness to countenance this mockery of Islamic justice was removed from his position and was cast aside. Now, if we then move on to Ayatollah Khamenei, who was the person who succeeded him in 1989, it's interesting to see that, first of all, he could only ascend to this position when the state acknowledged the fact that it could not find someone to fill Khomeini's shoes, in the sense of being both a theological, religious authority and having the correct revolutionary credentials. So the Iranian constitution was amended in order to allow someone who was revolutionary correct but religiously junior to take the position. And that is Ayatollah Khamenei, who wasn't an Ayatollah at that time. He was a Hujjatul Islam. Now, Khamenei's way of making decisions is much more roundabout, and that partly, of course, comes from the fact that he is not and was not senior or as important or influential as Khomeini was. So he had to countenance the various groups within the political elite in a different way than Khomeini had to. But nonetheless, it is clear that he seems very unwilling to take clear-cut decisions. And with time, as those decisions have become more and more important, this lack of willingness to take them means that the consequences have become more and more dire. You could, if you want to be a bit mean, and I can afford to, you could say that in a sense, when he has tried hard to make decisions, has been primarily in domestic politics and always with the instinct of someone who does not know where his society is. So in a sense, the most important decisions he has taken, like for instance the way he dealt with elections in 2009, were on the idea that whatever is happening in society domestically is dangerous for the system and therefore has to be stopped. This kind of, if you will, hardline paranoia of being afraid of losing control might tactically mean that you are establishing and reinforcing your control, but strategically it means that you're losing control. So in a sense, when he has taken decisions, the decisions have not ended up where he wanted them to end up. And I think, for instance, 2009 was probably one of the decisions that endangered the Islamic Republic as a political institution more than anything else. So the decisions have actually gone in the opposite direction of what he was intending. It's also important, of course, not to get obsessed with a person. In the same way that everyone is obsessing with Donald Trump, people have a tendency to sit around and think of Khamenei, what he wants and doesn't want, is he having a bad hair day, etc., etc. Obviously, there is more to this than just one simple person. And I think it is interesting to see, a bit parallel perhaps to Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, that when your instincts are as conservative as Khamenei's, and you tend to then upgrade and continuously support the more conservative wings of your own political system, they grow naturally. And at some point, they become very radically conservative. And then you end up being the person who's supposed to deal with having created that monster. And the problem for hardliners in Iran is, of course, that just like Khamenei, they don't know what they want. Khamenei's biggest problem probably is that his vision for Iran is an anti-vision. It's the lack of a vision. It's very unclear where he wants Iran to end up, let alone how to get there. And therefore, Iranian hardliners, the best way of making them silent, in a sense, is to give them power, because once they have power, they have no idea what they want to do with it. They're much more comfortable just complaining about the other side, the reformists or the liberals or whoever. But in terms of what they want for Iran, they're much more hard-pressed in showing you where Iran is supposed to go. It's always more about crying wolf over the dangers of the other side than actually having a positive vision of where Iranian society should go. This is, in any political system, somewhat of a problem. But it is, of course, a much bigger problem where society itself has moved away from you and has done so for many, many years. The least you can say for the reformists, and they have all various kinds of problems themselves, is that at least in general they do understand that they're trying to govern over a post-revolutionary society. That the Iranian society in many ways, in terms of social habits, in terms of expectations, in terms of ambitions, is somewhere far removed from the kind of 1980s idea that the hardliners are entertaining. That much at least the reformists, I think, have understood. Now, whether they can do something about reconciling the state they are part of and that society is a different issue. But it seems to me that for many hardliners, they simply do not want to take in this knowledge, or at least they refuse to in any way take action that acknowledges that this is the case. So, in domestic politics, Khamenei's decision-making has primarily alienated people more than anything else. We know this also from the fact that the number of moments where Iranian society erupts in protests, whether they're small due to governance, like people not getting paid in time for months, or bigger ones that are triggered either by the elections in 2009, the closing of newspapers and the lack of a press law in 1999, and then of course the various eruptions in 2018, 2019, and of course the latest one, Mahsa Jina Amini protests in 2022. So in all those moments, you can see that the state's first instinct is to always try and exert and establish control. Then sometimes there are tactical compromises, like at the moment, with regard to the hijab in Iran. But the problem is that society, it seems, is less and less interested in tactical compromises. It doesn't want not having to wear the hijab implicitly for the next 3 months, and then something changes in the state and suddenly reinforcement goes full on again. Society requires predictability and justice. Ironically, the very things that brought about the constitutional revolution in 1906. And that is something that the political elite of the Islamic Republic so far has been unable to get itself to. To get itself to be able to say yes wholeheartedly to anything, or no, but does not seem to exist. Instead, you have this muddling through. And the problem with the muddling through is that it works as a tactical response, but once it becomes the strategy, that is the only thing you do, maslahat, it's very difficult for anyone to believe anything you say. And more importantly, it's very difficult for anyone to invest in society and in politics, because it brings an arbitrariness as a principle. And that simply will not work in the long run. And again, Iran is under such pressure, domestically, but also in foreign policy, that the combination makes this kind of muddling through very difficult to sustain. In the other area, I've been talking about domestic politics. In foreign policy, I think the Iranian political elite, and especially Khamenei himself, have had much greater difficulty even to take bad decisions. Or in essence, you can say that the bad decisions are not taking any decisions. The only time he went out of his comfort zone was when he agreed to the negotiations on the nuclear issue that resulted in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. And that was, in a sense, an exception not only for him, but also an exception for the Americans and the Europeans. It was the only time, in a sense, that everyone made an exception to their usual way of doing business at the same time. And that resulted in an agreement that was very much a diplomatic success, and from a non-proliferation point of view, also very much a success. The problem was, of course, that it turned out to be an exception to the rule. That is, that the politics and the political instincts of several of these countries, more importantly the United States, went back to its normal way. Insofar that you can say that Donald Trump represents a new normal, combined with the old idea that pressure is the only thing that works on Iran, it, in a sense, was the death knell for this agreement. And today we are now back into snapback, which means that all the sanctions that this agreement removed are returned. We are in a worse situation than we were before, because there is absolutely no trust, but rather total mistrust of each other, because everyone tried and it worked, but then one of them destroyed it. And for Ayatollah Khamenei, of course, it is very comforting to know that it was exactly what he has claimed all along, which is that you can't trust the Europeans and you can't trust the Americans. So if you will, like anyone with a watch that is broken, at least twice per day, it does show the right time. So in that sense, he was right. At the absolutely worst moment for Iran and everyone else, it turned out that he was right in that very, very narrow sense. But that narrow sense is what the conservatives, hardliners, and he himself now make great hay out of by saying, we tried it, it didn't work, it will require a miracle to try again. Now, to be fair, it must also be said on that particular issue that the problem at this point does not necessarily lie primarily with Iran. The problem lies with the United States, whose decision-making process was much less convoluted than the Iranian one for sure, but more importantly, it was fairly robust. And that does not exist anymore. The great problem with the United States today, no matter which foreign policy issue you pick, is that there is no way of knowing what they want because they don't know themselves. It depends on who you ask in which wing of the White House and in which part of Foggy Bottom. And that means that for the Iranian side, even if they were to bring themselves together again and try, and I think Khamenei and many with him would probably not want that, or at least would want it with so many caveats that the question is whether it would work, is that there is no one on the other side of the table. Both, as we have seen in the case of Gaza and as we've seen in the case of Iran, the American side has this belief that some of its friends can bomb some of the people it's negotiating with while they're negotiating. And because you are the United States and you are so powerful, you can get away with this outright, very open duplicity. And I think it, so far at least, turns out that that's not the case. So in foreign policy, no particular decisions when they were needed, but one, if you will, very fateful strategic error that comes, as it often ironically does, from being successful. I think the biggest strategic blunder that Iran did was to get themselves involved in Syria. For two reasons. One, of course, is one of morals and credibility, if you will. And if you don't like those kind of arguments because you belong to the realist side of international relations, let me put it this way instead. If you are the weaker actor, a lot of your military strategy is based on guerrilla tactics. You're building strategic depth by finding friends and allies in countries elsewhere who are supposed to be the first line of defense. But more importantly, guerrillas are always in their weakest and most exposed moment when they are successful enough that they start thinking about actually controlling territory. Not just by night, but by day. And I think the Iranian willingness to station troops and get involved in the Syrian civil war wasn't just a losing proposition vis-a-vis Syria itself, but it gave the Israelis an immediate physical front through which it could attack Iran. And the Iranians then became more and more involved in order to be able to show that they have deterrence in a place where they could not deter anyone. If you are a guerrilla, you don't have jet fighters, you don't have that ability and that mobility. If you get yourself in that game, you will lose. So that's one. And the second strategic blunder, which in a sense has been perpetual and precedes Syria, is this fascinating belief, which I find fascinating for several reasons. More importantly, of course, because this is the Islamic Republic. It's built its self-image when it comes to foreign policy on its enmity with the United States. If you ask the hardliners, it's at the core of things, at least rhetorically, and then they have to live by it. And that is that they seem to believe that the Western powers are very rational, and that politics in the United States somehow is rational. They're very willing, behind closed doors, to admit how convoluted and complicated their own political system is, and how some of the arguments being made in Iranian politics are irrational, but have a tendency to think that decision makers in London, Paris, Tel Aviv, and Washington, D.C. do a rational calculus, because if they do, they would reach the conclusion that war with a country like Iran does not pay off. And therefore, and this is correct, it doesn't, but therefore they would then avoid a war with Iran. They would avoid a confrontation with Iran. And the point is that that's not how it works. American politics in particular, and this goes before Trump, is not a rational game. Never was. And when you are the size of the United States, you can afford to be irrational. No other country on earth would have afforded to do Iraq and then go home shopping. The United States is the only country who could do that. So when the Iranians think that the Americans will refrain from that kind of ultimate confrontation based on the idea that it costs more than it tastes, that's not true. And then when you come to Israel, it's quite evident that if you are a country that is militarily superior and backed to the hilt by the Europeans and the Americans, you can always defer the cost, whatever cost there is. So you are in a sense confronted with enemies whose calculations are not what you think they are. And the last 2 years have proven that the Americans, and the Israelis in particular, are more than happy to push every button that the Iranians claim is red and should not be pushed. And so far, the price they have paid has been minimal. And therefore, no reason for them to learn a different lesson. They can simply continue as they have. And I think, so the problem for decision makers in Tehran today, both in domestic and in foreign policy, is simply that everyone around them who don't like them aren't afraid enough of them. And now trying to make them afraid of you as a way of deterring them is a bit late in the game. And that means that Iran, in a sense, needs to compromise. But in order to compromise, it needs to make the decision for itself on what and how much it is willing to compromise in order to be able to reach that goal. But instead, what is happening is that they're jumping from one piece of grass to another in order to avoid getting mired and drown in the bog. And there is only so far you can jump before you take a misstep, and then you're starting to drown. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is not, to be consistent, is not that these are decision makers who don't know things. It's often an idea in politics, or rather those of us who observe politics, that if people just knew enough, if the decision makers just had enough information, they would make good decisions. The thing is that what we know from history is that often it's not a lack of information. It's a lack of political insight and courage in willing to pay the cost of risking to do something you haven't done before in order to reach a different result. So I don't think that people like Khamenei don't understand, as in don't know, literally, or don't have information. The problem is whether they're willing to process it and reach a different conclusion than the one they had before they had the information, which is to stay in their comfort zone, thinking that they can muddle through. So, ironically, and this will be my final point, a revolution etymologically means a circular movement. And it's coined, of course, from the French Revolution, which resulted in an emperor, Napoleon, who was more absolutist and more willful and more powerful than the king that the revolutionaries executed. So, in a sense, in Iran today, we have a supreme leader who is very much like a monarch. Rahbar Maqam, he is the absolute leader of the revolution. And at the same time, so he's a bit like a monarch. And in that sense, no one can avoid him. He sits dead in the middle. But at the same time, he is basically too weak or too unimaginative to be willing to risk his legacy in order to change things enough for Iran to go in a different direction. So in order to save his legacy, he's probably risking everything. And in many ways, this is an impasse that he has put himself and Iran in totally in his own making. Absolutely, the sanctions have played a role. Absolutely, the enmity of other countries like the US has played a role. But in the end, whatever power he has and can have, and whatever power the political elite can have, comes from inside. And so, if you go back to that very French Revolution, it is said that the Prussian monarch, one of the countries that the French invaded, was too afraid of his own peasants to give them arms to help the army defend the country against the French. And I think what the Islamic Republic is realizing that if you mistreat your own people the way they have, you create chinks in your armor, and these are the chinks that the Israelis have used to good effect as far as they're concerned. So you have to, in a sense, decide if you trust your own people. And if you trust your own people, your defenses will be better. But that means risking your own political privileges. And that is the decision that it seems the majority of decision makers in Tehran have yet to make. And the longer the wait, the greater the risk to everyone. Thank you.
Rouzbeh, that was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I was sitting here thinking, I can't wait to read this again. So I sincerely hope you capture these on paper and give it to Iranian Studies Unit, of course, to publish. Thank you so much. I'm going to use the privilege of a chair to ask a question before I open it up to Q&A. You mentioned briefly the issue of hijab, and we all know that 2 days ago, actually consistent with what you were saying, it was not a religious authority who made the announcement, but it was a member of the Guardian Council who came out and said the Islamic Republic will no longer enforce mandatory hijab. And I actually immediately, as soon as I read this, I texted a friend of mine in Tehran, and I said, is this a cultural revolution? That the Islamic Republic now suddenly says that mandatory hijab is no longer mandatory, or hijab is no longer mandatory. And we all know that for the Islamic Republic, women's appearance has been emblematic of what the state stands for, because they literally wear their identity or the official identity of the state. So as I was listening to you, is this one of those tactical retreats that the state has embarked on, and so 3 months from now somebody's going to say, no, he was wrong, and when the Israeli threat is no longer there, then they go back to perceiving women as a threat? Or is it a product of a cultural revolution? Are we seeing the Islamic Republic finally going the way of China? So Islamic Republic being as Islamic as the People's Republic of China is communist?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think the jury is still out. But I think maybe sometimes it is under the shadow of the sword of Damocles that these kind of decision makers finally get their act together and take a decision. Now, the problem in a sense in the Iranian case is that even when they take a decision, the question is how long it lasts. That's what makes it tactical. So I think, if you will, the only way to reassure the population that this is an actual decision and not just a tactical retreat, would be for someone like Khamenei himself to go out. But that then requires that he's willing to own up to the fact that the direction that he has presided over for 40 years does not work. And the question is whether he has the humility to do that.
Right, right. In an article, I argued 2 years ago, I argued that it's not Israel or the United States that the Iranian government is scared of. It's its own women that it is actually scared of. Which, yeah. Professor?
Thank you. Good presentation. We learned a lot. Thank you.
Hold on, there's a thing coming. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A good presentation. We learned a lot.
Sorry, I should have announced, not that this isn't directed at you. I would appreciate if you keep your questions brief.
Yes.
Keep them in the form of a question rather than a comment. And this way, there's a bunch of hands. We can get to everybody. That wasn't directed at you, Ibrahim.
It's fine. Very straightforward question. How do you see Iran's foreign policy changing, if any, after the last confrontation with Israel, the war, especially with relations to the militias in the region? Is it reforming the axis of resistance, departing from the axis of resistance, starting in one? How do you see that changing? Thank you.
Let me take two or three. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this analysis, and it requires a bit more reflection. But tell me, I saw how you related the internal complexities with the relationship with the West, with the US and Europe and so on. How would you then juxtapose that with Iranian's relationship with its Arab neighbors within Europe? And secondly, with regard to the Iranian situation, and as it's evolving in geopolitics, what keeps you awake at night about it?
We have a very brief question and not a comment from the gentleman. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Dr. Kamrava. Fortunately, I have a lot of the question and some comments. If you
no comment and
no
just one
problem,
question
okay.
because we have a
First
lot
of
of
all,
questions
I would like
we got to get to.
that's thanks from Dr. Parsi for his
We have time for comments afterwards.
Okay,
just
eloquent
a question.
presentation. We fully respect, but we have let me that some opposition with some point that raised by Dr. Just I want to raise this question. In your opinion, Doctor, do you think that is it right that we use the term of the revolutionary or former revolutionary for a person who killed or massacred more than 25,000 innocent Iranian and assassinate our former president, assassinate the Speaker of Parliament, assassinate 72 deputy of Parliament? They call them the former revolutionary. No, MKO is always the communist and the loyalty to that Communist Party. They are not the revolutionary.
Okay, so the question is the Mujahideen
in the massacre in
revolutionary or not?
1998?
Okay, thank you. Can I take one more question and then we'll take another round? I'll come to Your Excellency, but if I could take the gentleman behind, and then we'll come for a second round.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure because I also come from Sweden. I'm only Swedish here. The interesting thing is that we are now facing a similar problem in Yemen, where I come from. There's a new regime that is seeing the Iranian model as an example. So what sort of advice do you think one could give to that sort of regime that is brewing and beginning to adapt similar patterns we see in Iran?
Rosemary, can I take one more? Okay. One more.
Good morning, Prof. Good morning to the audience. I am the ambassador of Liberia. And before becoming a diplomat, I was a journalist. So when I started journalism, the first subject that I dealt with was the Iranian Revolution. So I'm very interested in what's happening this morning. But my question here is to the Prof. There have been so many changes. I'd like to know what is actually happening now, especially for the past 3-4 years, concerning the hijab, concerning the Revolutionary Guard and other aspects in the economy, the socio-economic development, education. Can you please throw some light on that?
Okay, now?
Go ahead, yes.
Thank you. Ibrahim, regarding your question on militias, I mean, I think it depends a bit on what the next war is going to look like, because there will be another one. I think the idea of look, there are those in Iran who will always, console themselves, always will tell you, look, the world goes up and down, the Americans come and go, and ironically, we are a very old nation, we're going to survive this, we have strategic patience, etc. And I think there is some truth to that, but it still assumes that you being a pillar standing still can overcome the immediate force of whoever is coming at you. And I think what the Israelis did not manage to move the pillar, okay? But they did show that they can very much hurt it, recalibration. Because the militias are important for your political influence, but it turns out that they are militarily not particularly efficient. So in that sense, if you look at what happened during those 12 days, the only important thing that Iran could do that could not deter, but hurt the Israelis enough to make them think twice was their own missiles. It's theirs, they're at home, you can make them yourselves, and that, in a sense, is where they will need to go. And that means that you have two clocks here. They're moving at different speed. The Israelis, because they are a much smaller nation, need to have quick wars because they cannot sustain that kind of campaign for, how many days, no matter how much support they get from the Americans. And they need to go in decisively, kill whoever they need to kill, and then kind of get out. And the hope is then that every time they do that, this system becomes weaker and weaker in its ability to hit back. The Iranians, on the other hand, want and prefer a slow clock. They use the structural superiority of being a country of 92 million people with that kind of area that they have. And they're also used to taking a beating in a way the Israelis are not. If you were to shut down Tehran airport for a day or two, that would be very bad. But Iran isn't going to go anywhere. If you shut down the main airport of a first world country like Israel every other day, that is going to have huge economic consequences. So I think that's what they were, what they're hoping. Low intensity, nothing big and fancy. And the Israelis are simply not going to let them stay there. So I think that's where they will need to kind of recalibrate the meaning of those militias. Now, relations with Arab neighbors. I think, and this goes back to Iranian nationalism. I mean, Iranian nationalism, in the same way that European nationalism and European self-identity is very much based on having an other, and that other were the Muslims, wherever they were from, because the Europeans couldn't be bothered with figuring out which Muslims from where. Just, they're the other. In the same way, Iranian nationalism has been built on the Arab other. So Iranian nationalism in the early 20th century was very much an idea based on this glorious Achaemenid empire, and the Arabs came with their religion and they ruined us, blah, blah, blah. So the Islamic Republic, to some degree, is also a response to that state-sponsored nationalism of the Pahlavi monarchy, saying, no, we are Muslims. Doesn't mean that they are less prejudiced against Arabs, though. And I think what the last 4 or 5 years have shown is that they've had to recalibrate how they view their Arab neighbors, because before the easy way out was to claim they're just American client states. So you have a confluence of them understanding that the neighborhood matters much more than they were willing to admit, and also that the Arab Gulf states have become much more active in their foreign policy and much more, at least rhetorically and practically, independent of the United States in what they do. They believe themselves to have and show their agency much more, and this is something that the Iranians need to take into account. So it doesn't mean that the relationship is great, doesn't mean that they're all great friends, because you have to remember, I usually tell my students this, imagine that all Iranians disappear tomorrow and were replaced with 92 million Buddhist, peace-loving vegetarians from anywhere on this planet. The Arab Gulf states would still fear them, because there's 92 million of them, and it's huge. When you look north from here, that's all you see. That's the whole coastline. So in that sense, you can say this is not a cop-out for the Iranians. It doesn't matter what we do, they won't like us. But it means that Iran will always be a concern. Now, it can be a lot of concern, it can be less of a concern. And I think it has become a bit less of a concern for two reasons. The Iranians are behaving more like a neighbor, helps a bit. But perhaps, and this is not to Iran's credit, the Israelis have gone bonkers, as they say in Britain, which means that compared to the Israelis, Iran seems like an agent, if not of stability, at least of much less instability. They are creating less havoc in the region than what the Israelis are doing. So it's, you know, relative. So it doesn't mean that Iran should feel comfortable, but it means that at the moment they're in a better position than they were 10 years ago in their relations. And that can matter for everyone in a good way. Let me address the issue of Mujahideen Khalq. For me, it's kind of ironic. You see, when I give these kind of conversations elsewhere, and there are people from the Mujahideen Khalq, when I say that they are a religious political sect, then their fuses go like this. It doesn't matter whatever else I said. It doesn't matter that I say that they were killed unlawfully in mass executions. They don't like how I characterize them. They were part of the revolution. Historically speaking, there is no way around it. The fact that they're communists doesn't make any difference. The point is that the revolutionary spectrum was not just the people around Khomeini. It was also various leftist groups. And just like in every other revolution, the revolution eats its own children, which means that the part of the revolutionaries that won kill off the other revolutionaries. And in this case, it was the Islamists who won. They imprisoned the others, and they killed them. Now, change in the last couple of years. I think the change is partly the generational one. I think the interesting thing is that if you look at the young people in Iran today, they are so much less interested in the kind of political conversations and games that the older generations have had to play in order to find space within this authoritarian system. So if you look at the young girls who would go out and revolt in 2022, they were just basically saying this system sucks and we don't want any part of it. And we're not interested in having a conversation about how it can be modified or mollified or anything like that. And I think that tells you how fed up people are. But here comes the but. That in and of itself does not translate into the kind of political pressure that can force an authoritarian state to change its course. For that, you need organization, you need tenacity, and you end up in a kind of a war of attrition, because that is the only way of getting an authoritarian system to buckle, or at least change some of its ways. So that has been the problem for all people who have protested in Iran in the last 30 years, is that they go out, they risk their lives, they do it in more or less massive ways, but they have not, because they live in an authoritarian system, not been able to sustain that sentiment and that willingness over time in a way that makes the state not only willing, but forces the state to listen to them. So I think we're reaching a point where everyone is so fed up, and that means that the state has to listen, but the question, what will be the end result? What will be the changes? Because people cannot organize themselves in ways that makes them be able to go through with the expectations they have vis-a-vis the state. Yemen, what you can learn from Iran. Well, I mean, this sounds like a very boring conservative argument, but I think one of the things that Iran tells us, like many other revolutions, is that revolutionary goals can be fantastic, but you usually end up with something that often is worse than what you were trying to replace. The thing being this, very radical change ends you up in the other side of the ditch. And in this case, what you can say is that Iran shows that if you want to be a modern country, and the Islamists that did their revolution did want and do want to live in a modern country, there are limits to how much you can make a society conform to your particular ideals. And the justification you use for it, in this case religion, just means, as I said, that people lose respect for religion and religious authority, and the state becomes unmanageable. So it's the worst of two worlds.
Perfect. Thank you so very much, Ruzbe. I really appreciate it. I think there's what I hear is that you need to come back next year and share with us where we stand. Please join me in thanking Ruzbe Parsi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.